The silver fork trembled slightly in Evelyn Hart's hand as she set it down beside the untouched salmon fillet on her porcelain plate. Around her, the opulent dining room grew silent, eerily so, save for the steady tick of the antique grandfather clock in the far corner. It was one of the only things she'd kept after her husband Daniel passed, a reminder of a time when rooms were filled with warmth, not weaponized conversation. Across the gleaming mahogany table, her son Graham swirled his glass of red wine, his voice soft but laced with mockery. "Camille's mother just bought a second condo in Sarasota," he said with a shrug. "She also has that lakefront place up north. But you, still living above that laundromat, aren't you, Mom?" The words landed like slaps, not just because of what was said, but how. The glint in Graham's eyes, the smirk that followed, and the subtle nod of approval Camille gave him from his side, like they were tag-teaming in some cruel, elegant sport. Even their teenage children sat frozen, forks suspended mid-air, uncertain but instinctively aware of the moment's sharpness. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She looked at her son, not glanced, but truly looked. He was nearly 50 now, broad-shouldered like his father, but none of Daniel's kindness lived in his face anymore. Life's comforts had dulled him, and whatever empathy he once held had been worn down by entitlement and wealth. His navy blazer probably cost more than what Evelyn had spent on clothing in the last 5 years, but she didn't envy him, not anymore. She inhaled slowly, deeply. "Actually," she said, her voice calm and almost too smooth, "I moved a while ago." Graham's fork paused mid-air. "I live in a cottage by the ocean now," she added. The lie came out so naturally she almost believed it herself. The room went utterly still. Camille's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Even the clock seemed to tick slower. "Only the people who care about me know about it," Evelyn added. Her words were light, but they struck like iron. Her 16-year-old granddaughter, Isla, blinked from the far end of the table. "You have a house by the ocean, Grandma?" Evelyn rose from her seat, her joints protesting, the chair scraping gently across the marble floor.
"I should go," she said softly. "Thank you for dinner." "Wait, Mom, what are you talking about?" Graham asked, his voice rising slightly. She stopped at the threshold of the dining room, beside the family portrait hung on the wall. Taken last Christmas, Evelyn had been notably absent because no one had invited her. "The house where I belong," she said, not looking back, "is the one where people who love me actually visit." And with that, Evelyn Hart stepped out of her son's house, heels echoing across the foyer like punctuation. The cold evening air outside slapped her cheeks as she walked toward her car. Graham lived in a neighborhood designed to whisper wealth, neatly trimmed hedges, driveways like runways, and doors that probably hadn't been knocked on by a stranger in years. She had co-signed the mortgage for this very house when Graham's credit had failed him. That was before Camille, before the silences, before she became invisible. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled out her car keys. The dented old Civic sat like a quiet witness to the life she'd led. Small, worn, but dependable. She'd bought it used after pawning the last piece of jewelry Daniel had given her, her wedding ring. She slid into the seat and started the engine. It rattled softly, then hummed to life. She didn't cry. Not yet. The 23-minute drive to her apartment was a path she knew too well, every turn, every light, every landmark reminding her just how wide the gap had grown between her life and her son's. 23 minutes of fences, laughter inside lit windows, and houses where mothers were welcomed. Her building sat like a tired sigh at the edge of downtown. Sunset Haven Apartments, beige stucco, rusty balcony railings, and a parking lot of wary cars. She parked, climbed the stairs to 2C, and turned the key in the lock. The smell of boiled cabbage from a neighboring unit greeted her like an old frenemy. Inside, everything was quiet. A single lamp lit her tiny kitchen, a Murphy bed folded into the wall, one working stove burner. A chipped rose pattern mug waited by the kettle like a patient friend. She boiled water, made tea, sat in her armchair by the window, and for the first time in a long, long while, she lied. But it wasn't a regretful lie. It was a spark, an idea, possibility.
Evelyn Hart didn't sleep much that night. She sat for hours in her thrift store armchair, mug in hand, watching the silhouettes of the neighborhood kids down in the parking lot. They gathered around a flickering street lamp, laughing and shoving each other playfully. Evelyn couldn't hear them, not really, but the joy radiated. It reminded her of something distant and long buried, what it felt like to be seen, to be part of something. The lies she'd told over dinner lingered like perfume, an odd mix of guilt and something else, something thrilling. A house by the ocean. It had rolled off her tongue like it already existed, and now, in the quiet of her 400-square-foot studio apartment, she wondered, what if it could? The next morning, Evelyn woke up early, made a cup of black tea, and stared into the mirror. Her face was softer around the edges than it used to be, the skin thinner, more translucent. But her eyes, those eyes still carried fire, determined, alert. "Who are you really?" she whispered to the reflection. She didn't plan the drive. Her hands guided the wheel without permission, pulled by instinct. Hours passed in silence, the roads rolling out before her like chapters in an unfinished story. She passed small towns with antique shops and shuttered gas stations. Eventually, the air changed, salty, moist, alive. Rockport, Texas. She hadn't been here in over 30 years, not since her honeymoon with Daniel. They'd walked the harbor, shared cheap ice cream, and talked about dreams, back when life had been wide open. The moment she stepped out of the car, the sea breeze greeted her like an old friend. She inhaled deeply. It smelled like salt, memory, and freedom. She wandered the marina, letting her thoughts settle like sand in a jar. Fishing boats rocked gently against the tide. Gulls shrieked overhead. The world didn't seem to care who she was or what she'd lost. It just moved forward, steady and endless. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" a voice said behind her. Evelyn turned. A woman stood nearby, silver-haired and strong-boned, with a long braid tucked over one shoulder. Her jeans were paint-splattered, and her sweater looked like it had survived decades of sea wind.
"I'm Margot Lane," the woman said, offering a firm handshake. "Got a little art studio a few blocks over. I come out here when I forget why I started painting." "Evelyn," she replied. "Evelyn Hart." Margot tilted her head thoughtfully. "You look like you're carrying something heavy." Evelyn hesitated. Then, perhaps because the ocean made her brave, she confessed. "I told a lie yesterday," she said, her voice low. "A big one." Margot grinned. "Good. About damn time we started telling the kind of stories that give us power." Evelyn laughed. It surprised her how real it sounded. "I told my son I owned a house by the sea," she said. Margot didn't blink. "I've lived in the same beach house for 30 years. It's nothing special. 2 bedrooms, a leaky roof. But the view? Worth more than gold." She paused. "I've been thinking about getting a housemate. Someone quiet. Maybe someone who talks to birds or writes in the margins of library books." Evelyn blinked. "Are you offering?" Margot shrugged. "Why not? I've always had good luck with women who carry sadness in their shoulders and stories in their back pockets." Evelyn's throat tightened. I don't have much. Fixed income, some savings I barely touch. I wouldn't want to be a burden. I'm not looking to make money, Margot said. I'm trying to make space. They stood in silence, the waves whispering at their backs.
Then Margot handed her a business card. Simple, unadorned, no website, just a name, number, and the words, Studio Lane, Rockport. "Think about it," she said. Evelyn didn't call Graham that night. She didn't text him, didn't explain. Instead, she sat at her kitchenette, staring at Margot's card. She could feel something shifting, something shaking loose from years of being contained. The next morning, she made her decision. She packed 2 suitcases and 3 boxes, gave notice to the building manager. Her lease had 3 weeks left, but she told him to keep the deposit. Some things were more expensive to stay for than to leave behind. The silence didn't last long. By that afternoon, Graham had started calling, then texting. "Mom, are you okay? You're not answering. Please respond. Where exactly are you? Are you having an episode? Camille says we should call your doctor." Evelyn powered off her phone. 2 days later, she was standing in front of a weathered little house painted sea green, with peeling shutters and wildflowers growing along the fence line. Margot was there, waiting with a smile and a dolly cart. Together they carried in Evelyn's boxes. The home smelled of lemon oil, paint, and something else. Something like life. Evelyn's books filled a small shelf in the hallway. A framed photo of Daniel rested on the mantel. She had been there less than an hour when there was a knock at the door. Margot peeked through the window and muttered, "Brace yourself." Outside stood Graham, red-faced, breath-tight, his phone clenched in one hand like a weapon. Camille was behind him, lips pressed into a line. And next to them, a woman in a gray blazer holding a clipboard. "Who's that?" Evelyn whispered.
"Looks like social services," Margot said flatly. "Happens more than you'd think." Evelyn opened the door halfway. "Graham? Camille?" "Mom," Graham said, voice brittle. "We've been worried sick. You just vanished. And now this woman is saying you might be mentally unfit. What's going on?" The woman with the clipboard stepped forward. "Miss Hart, I'm Leah Forrest. We received a call expressing concern over possible financial exploitation and mental confusion. I'd like to speak with you privately if that's all right." Margot stepped into view beside Evelyn. "You can speak to her," she said, her tone ironclad, "but not like she's a problem to solve." Leah nodded. "Of course." Evelyn took a long breath. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "I'm not confused. I'm not being exploited. I moved because I chose to, because I deserve to." Graham scoffed. "Mom, come on. Be serious. How are you even affording this place?" Evelyn met his gaze. "You never asked what I was capable of. You just assumed I was nothing without you." The silence that followed was a chasm. The clipboard woman gave a quiet nod and excused herself. Camille said nothing. Graham looked at the floor, then turned and walked away. No apology, just retreat. When the door shut, Evelyn leaned against it and released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since Daniel's funeral. Margot handed her a cup of hot tea. "You did good." Evelyn laughed, a nervous, shaky sound. "I feel like I might throw up." "You won't," Margot said. "You'll remember how to stand tall again, you'll find your rhythm, you'll remember who the hell you are."
Weeks passed, then a month. The rhythm of the ocean seeped into Evelyn's bones, slow, deliberate, eternal. Her days settled into something steady and nourishing. She woke at dawn, sipped coffee in a blue enamel mug, and wrote quiet letters to Daniel in a leather-bound journal. Sometimes she read them aloud on the back porch, where the ocean answered in waves. Margot never interrupted. In the afternoons, Evelyn wandered through her past, sorting through boxes of photographs, old recipes scribbled in fading ink, postcards sent from places she never visited. She began deciding which memories still deserved space in her future. Evenings were for long walks by the shoreline, the sky folding into shades of rose and rust. Some nights, Margot cooked. Some nights, Evelyn did. They shared simple meals and laughter that echoed off the kitchen walls, jokes only women past 60 would understand. One stormy evening, as wind lashed at the windows and the sea howled in protest, Margot poured 2 glasses of sherry and turned to Evelyn. "You're coming back to life," she said. Evelyn looked out toward the water, where lightning briefly lit the black horizon. "I think I am." It was true. She felt it in her chest, like sap rising in an old tree after a long winter. Not fast, not loud, but certain. She had spent her entire life making space for others, her husband, her son, her responsibilities, until there was no space left for herself. But here, in this small, weathered house by the ocean, she was reclaiming herself one breath at a time. Then one crisp morning in early spring, Evelyn heard the knock. She was seated at the writing desk Margot had cleared for her by the dormer window, pen in hand, a cup of mint tea cooling beside her. The sky blushed pink as the sun rose. She opened the door and found a young woman standing on the porch. Jeans stained with paint, nervous smile, and eyes that caught Evelyn's breath. "Is this Mrs. Hart?" she asked, voice tight with hesitation. "I'm looking for Evelyn Hart."
"That's me," Evelyn said slowly. "I'm Isla Carter," the girl said. "I'm your granddaughter." Evelyn blinked. For a second, she couldn't speak. The last time she saw Isla, she'd been 16. Soft-eyed, quiet, unsure. Now she stood taller. Her posture was firmer, but there was a grief in her expression that Evelyn recognized immediately. The kind that came from betrayal you couldn't name. "Come in," Evelyn said at last, stepping aside. They sat at the small kitchen table, the sunlight casting soft gold across the worn wood. "I didn't come with permission," Isla said. "Dad doesn't know I'm here." Evelyn didn't flinch. She waited. "He told us you were confused, that you'd wandered off, that no one should reach out to you. Do I seem confused to you?" Evelyn asked gently. Isla smiled, a crooked, tired smile. "No, you seem free." They sat in silence, the tea steaming between them. "I've thought a lot about that night, at dinner, when you said only people who cared about you would know where to find you." She paused. "I realized I wanted to be one of those people." Evelyn's heart clenched in her chest. She reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly, and rested it over Isla's. "You came," she whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything that night. You didn't deserve the silence. You were a child. You owed me nothing, but I'm glad you're here now." Isla looked down, then up again.
"I want to know you, not as the woman who used to come for holidays, but as the woman who walked away and started again." Outside, waves crashed softly against the shore like punctuation marks. Evelyn squeezed her hand. "Well then," she said, "let's begin." Isla didn't leave after that. What started as a weekend visit turned into a week, then two, and finally, one wind-chilled afternoon, as gulls wheeled overhead, she asked, "Are the spare rooms still available?" "Are you sure?" Evelyn asked. "I don't think I'm going back home," Isla replied. "Not for a while." Evelyn didn't press for details. She didn't need to. She recognized the sadness in Isla's eyes, the kind that comes from realizing your family doesn't always see you as you are. Instead, they got to work. They turned the cluttered garden shed behind the house into a makeshift studio. Evelyn cleared out rusted tools and cracked flower pots. Isla swept the dust, strung up lights, and painted the walls a fresh white. The smell of cedar mixed with turpentine and new beginnings. They named it Two Shorelines, because we're not just from different generations, Isla said with a grin. We're two tides pulled by the same moon. They painted side by side, Isla with wild, bold brushstrokes and neon colors, Evelyn with soft washes and quiet skies. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But the silence between them was never heavy. It was full of understanding. When a local gallery announced an open call for coastal artists, Isla hesitated. Evelyn didn't. Without saying a word, she submitted both their work. "You what?" Isla cried later, holding the acceptance email. "We were born for this," Evelyn replied, sipping her tea. On the night of the exhibit, the gallery glowed with warm light and murmured voices. Evelyn wore a soft blue scarf Isla had gifted her. Her hands trembled as strangers wandered past her paintings. Low Tide at Dusk was a seascape she had painted in her second week by the shore. It sold for $2,400. Evelyn cried in the parking lot. Not because of the money, but because, after years of feeling invisible, someone saw her and called it beautiful. That night, back on the porch, they celebrated with ginger tea and starlight. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, listening to the waves, her heart swollen with something she hadn't felt in decades: belonging. 6 months after the gallery exhibit, Evelyn stood barefoot in the kitchen, wrist-deep in bread dough, humming quietly to herself. The sunlight spilled across the floor in long, golden fingers. A breeze carried in the scent of salt, rosemary, and drying paint. This house, once her biggest lie, had become the truest part of her life. It wasn't just where she escaped. It was where she became, where she stopped performing for people who never clapped, where she finally let go of being everything to everyone and started being enough for herself. She smiled at the thought, dusted her hands, and peeked into the backyard. Isla was out there, barefoot, dancing with paintbrushes in her hands. Her laughter flew freely into the sky, a wild sound Evelyn had grown addicted to. There was so much life in this place now. And then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked in a cream-colored envelope, addressed in her son Daniel's neat handwriting. She hadn't seen his name in over a year. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Mom, I didn't think I'd ever write this, not after the way things ended. But then Isla told me she visited you, and then she stayed. She said you were happy, happier than I've ever seen you. She said you were painting again and that you looked alive. And it made me realize I was wrong. I thought I knew what was best for you. I thought I had to protect the version of you I'd built in my head. But I never asked who you really were. I'm sorry for that, for my arrogance, for making you feel like your life was mine to manage. Isla asked me to visit. I told her I didn't know if you'd even want that. So, I'm asking. If you want me to come see you, send this envelope back, empty. That's all. Love, Daniel." Evelyn held the letter for a long time. She could feel the weight of decades behind every word, the ache of misunderstanding, the quiet hope of repair. She didn't cry. She just stood still, listening to the wind whistle through the porch screen. Then she walked to the drawer, pulled out the envelope, and slowly, gently tucked it into her coat pocket. That afternoon, she and Isla walked together along the beach. "You don't have to forgive him, you know," Isla said softly. "You owe him nothing." "I know," Evelyn replied, "but I think I'm ready to be seen by him, as I really am." Isla took her hand. "Then let him see this version." Evelyn smiled, nodded, and looked out at the sea, endless, alive, and utterly unafraid of change. A week later, Daniel arrived. The same man Evelyn had once raised, now with more gray in his beard and uncertainty in his shoulders. He stood awkwardly on the front step, holding a bouquet of flowers from a gas station and an apology folded in his eyes. Evelyn opened the door. Neither of them spoke for a beat. Then, quietly, she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. They didn't resolve everything in a day. There were tears. There was silence. There were stories told from two completely different angles, both wrong and right in their own way. But Daniel sat in the garden studio and looked at Evelyn's painting of a windswept shore, titled "The House I Lied About." He asked what it meant. Evelyn took a breath.
"Once, I made up a story about a house by the ocean to escape the life I didn't feel I belonged in," she said. "But now, this house is no longer fiction. It's mine, and so is the woman who lives in it." Daniel swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "I'm glad you found her." Evelyn nodded. "Me too." By fall, Two Shorelines opened an official gallery, just a converted room above the garage with white walls, track lighting, and local art. But it became a place where people wandered in from town, craving beauty, craving story. People began to know Evelyn Hart not as the woman who left or the woman who lied, but as the woman who bloomed late, boldly, without apology. And she told the truth now. She told it in her colors, in her brushstrokes, in the way she carried herself down to the beach every morning with her chin high and her soul unclenched. Because the truth was never just about a house. It was about choosing herself. It was about saying, "I deserve a life that feels like mine." And in this old coastal home, wrapped in sea spray and second chances, Evelyn Hart finally lived the truth out loud.